So as of the first game of this podcast, the Edmonton Oilers have just finished the first game of a two-game homestand against the Toronto Maple Leafs. And unfortunately, that first game didn't quite turn out the way that a lot of people probably hoped that it would. They went into the third period with a 3-2 lead, and they wound up giving up that lead and taking a 4-3 loss. I mean, of course, a loss never sounds good. But sometimes a loss sounds a lot worse than it actually is, and this is one of those cases where that is the case, because they actually played a very good, competitive, entertaining game. They played a pretty good 60 minutes of hockey, but really what the difference was in this particular case was it was a mistake by Mikko Koskinen. He gave the puck away at a very inopportune time. And that turned out to be the first goal of the game. Well, if you take away that first goal of the game, well, then at the end of that third period, they still would have been tied 3-3, gone to overtime, and then, well, something different could have happened. And while, of course, a loss is never really a good thing, at least it wasn't as bad as the previous game against Winnipeg, where they went into that third period with a lead again, and this time they got absolutely obliterated. I mean, on Thursday night, the Edmonton Oilers played a pretty good third period, but the Toronto Maple Leafs just played a better one. But you go back 2 nights prior to Tuesday when they were playing Winnipeg, and it was a very different story. The Edmonton Oilers, they just did not play a very good third period. As a matter of fact, they played a horrible third period. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that period really troubled me, and that was the fact that they just played that third period, they were soft. They had no battle level, they had no challenge level in the offensive zone. There were all sorts of shifts for that third and fourth line, for the third line and the fourth line, where they had absolutely zero penetration in the offensive zone. The Jets were basically able to just stand them up in that offensive zone, put the body on them, and turn them back with nothing to show for it. Now, there's obviously a lot to be said about that. I mean, in particular, one thing that has to be said is that there are some players on those two lines that, quite frankly, that is just not supposed to be happening to. That's just not supposed to be happening to Zach Kassian, but it did happen on Tuesday night. Jujhar Khaira is another guy that the Oilers have held on to strictly because they needed a guy with his kind of physical play. And all too often, you just don't see him show up with it. He didn't do it last year in the playoffs. And far too often this season, he has not shown up and played the way that he was supposed to play. I think really what it comes down to is readiness. And far too often, guys like Jujhar Khaira, they just do not show up ready to play. Whether it's at the start of the game or whether it's in between periods, it's a real problem when your players show up and they're not ready. And as much as I hate to say it, I know that this is not going to be a popular opinion. I know that a lot of people are going to respond to this in a very negative way, but I think that it just at this point it has to be said that there are some issues on this team with leadership. And as much as I hate to say it, I think that some of those problems very much do start at the very top with Connor McDavid. Now, I know that I'm going to hear something about having said that. Now, I've seen all kinds of examples of that where people have stepped up and they have basically said that Connor McDavid is suspicious in the leadership category. And they have been absolutely lambasted for it. They have been absolutely destroyed for it. They've been dragged for it. And quite frankly, I'm prepared to face that down. I'm prepared to hear people out and hear what they have to say about it. But this is what I have to say about it. And I think that we as Oilers fans, we have to know this. We know this full well, because who is one of our top alumnus? We're talking about Mark Messier in this particular case. We're talking about not only the gold standard of on-ice leadership in hockey, but we're talking about the gold standard of leadership in sports, period. The NHL award for leadership is named after Mark Messier. And we've had all kinds of fantastic on-ice leaders that have followed Mark Messier as the captain. We had guys like Jason Smith, guys like Ethan Morrow, even guys that never got to really wear the captaincy full-time, talking about guys like Ryan Smith. We know all about what on-ice leadership is in Edmonton because we have seen oodles of it. As a matter of fact, I think that at particular times in this team's history, we've been spoiled for it. I mean, talking about guys like Craig McTavish, talking about guys like Kelly Buchberger. Just excellent leader after excellent leader. And I think that when we compare the guy that we have there in terms of leadership skills, just strictly in terms of leadership skills, not in terms of what he can do on the ice, because what Connor McDavid can do on the ice blows almost all of those guys away, probably including Mark Messier. To be honest with you, I mean, Mark Messier was a fantastic player. he could do amazing things. He did amazing things. You know, you don't get to be the number 2 guy all time in points in the NHL without being a fantastic player. But in terms of leadership alone, you know, Mark Messier is a guy that I think that we need to look to for our comparison to decide whether or not we think that Connor McDavid is getting the job done as captain. And when I compare the two, yeah, I'm sorry, I have to draw the conclusion that really he's not. You know, the way that you see some of these guys on the Oilers play, and the way that you've seen them play over the last several years, and even going back to guys like Taylor Hall and guys like Jordan Eberle, you know, guys that were looked at as guys that were, you know, said to be just happy to be in the NHL. Mark Messier would have never tolerated the way that a lot of those guys played at times. I mean, one particular episode of Mark Messier's leadership that comes to mind was one that actually happened with Kent Nielsen when he was with the team. I mean, I think Kent Nielsen, he's more closely associated with the Calgary Flames than he is with the Edmonton Oilers, and I think that people forget that he ever was an Oiler. But he was. And there was an incident that happened in the locker room after a loss where he came in and he was absolutely furious with Nielsen because Nielsen was doing something that Nielsen was well known for at that particular time. And he was known as a guy that was very skilled, but he was also a guy that at times, you know, would not really pull his weight in the physical play department. He would kind of go around there and he would just kind of coast around, you know, and he wouldn't battle very much for the puck. And Messier went up and grabbed him in the locker room and he said to him, you know, you listen here, you little shit. You're a floater. You've always been a floater. And that's not how you're going to play here in Edmonton. And for the rest of his stay in Edmonton, Nielsen was a much different player after that because, well, he had the motivation of just not wanting to have to face down an angry moose in the locker room. I mean, honestly, I do recognize that the environment in the NHL is a little bit different now than it was then. I think that an actual, you know, a threat of imminent fisticuffs if you don't play the way that your captain wants you to play is probably something that would be strongly frowned upon in the NHL. You know, I mean, frowned upon at the very least. Think about this. You know, think about this very carefully. I mean, in all honesty, when was the last time that you could remember hearing a story about Connor McDavid actually confronting another player who wasn't pulling his weight? Actually going up to the guy, confronting him and telling him, hey, listen, you know, you got to get your shit together. Okay, you got to lock it up. When was the last time that you heard a story about that? Not only can I not think of a single example that I've heard about McDavid doing something like that, I can't even think of a single time when I have actually noticed McDavid, when McDavid has actually been noticed during a broadcast for talking to his other players on the bench. It seems to me like McDavid just kind of sits on his hands. Well, okay, you know what? I'm sorry. It's going a little too far. I'm sure that he's not doing that. But it seems to me that Connor McDavid is very deferential towards the coaching staff, which is fine. I mean, they have their place and he has his place. But one thing about the coaching staff is that they are not the on-ice leadership. He is the on-ice leadership. So he doesn't have to just sit there and clam up and just let the coaches say whatever it is that they have to say to these players. He's the one that has to take this thing by the horns. You know, Mark Messier's mother tells a story about him when he was still playing junior hockey in St. Albert. And she said that one thing that the coaches knew that they never really had to worry about was that when they went into that locker room, they knew that they didn't really have to say anything to their players to get them ready to go play. Because Mark had already been through there and he had already said his bit, he had already done what he needed to do, and they were all ready to go. Like game in, game out, he had those players psychologically ready to play. You know, I'm sorry to say that over the past few years, one thing that you could often say about the Oilers that you could not say very often at all is that they're a team that's ready to go in the first period. Now, one thing that a lot of people say about the Oilers, particularly when they look outside of the players who are actually on the roster, is that they talk about there being a lack of depth in Edmonton. And so at the very top of the echelon, so to speak, you know, you have your guys like Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and then after that there's what they consider to be a very steep drop-off in the ability of the players. But let's be real with ourselves. I think that this year, that honestly is not the case. I mean, it hasn't always been the case in the past. I mean, when you get down to that fourth line, sometimes things do look a little bit thin. But they went off in the offseason this year and they added some players that were, quite frankly, they were not slouches. Kyle Turris, he's only starting to offensively come to life over the past couple of games. But Kyle Turris is no slouch. Tyler Ennis was a guy that they brought back in the offseason. They traded for him, and unfortunately, a playoff injury, put him out of the playoffs, and, that was a shame because he was one of the better Oilers in those playoffs. Dominic Cahoon was a guy that they brought in because they expected him to have very good chemistry with Leon Draisaitl, and I think that we have seen some very promising moments. Not a lot of finish from Cahoon just yet, but that could change. 4 teams out of 5 in this league, James Neal would not be a bottom 6 winger. So there's another guy. Alex Chiasson, he frequently eats shit in terms of the way that the fans talk about him. But Alex Chiasson is a guy who has been to the 20-goal mountain. So is there a little bit of a drop-off in ability after you get past McDavid, Draisaitl, and Nugent-Hopkins? Well, okay, yes, there is some, but not as much as people are trying to claim that there is. These other players, they are much better players than they're being given credit for. And perhaps that could be some of the problem. But really, none of these guys are guys who have any business going out and sitting on their hands and thinking that they're just going to sit and wait for the big 3 guys to go out and dazzle the world. And I think that whatever it is that's happening in that locker room, and hey, you know what, I do realize that none of us are in the locker room. None of us are privy to everything that goes on there. We do have more information about what goes on in the locker room than ever before. These Messier stories, a lot of them didn't come out until, sometimes until after he was retired. But we don't know about everything that's going on in the locker room. We don't know about everything that's being said and everything that's being done. And if McDavid is in the locker room and he is saying all the right things and he is doing all the right things and the other guys are not responding, well, then that is an issue with them every bit as much as it is an issue with him. But it is also an issue with him. Now, if I'm wrong about all of that, I have to be honest with you. If I'm wrong about all of that, nothing in the world would actually make me happier than to be wrong about all of that. And you know what? If Don Cherry can eat shit for coming out and saying that Connor McDavid shouldn't have been made the captain when he was made the captain, well, then who am I to be resentful at having to eat shit about everything that I'm saying here? I'm not going to do it just because an angry mob may form and come and try to drag me for all these, for doubting David's leadership abilities. I do want to hear what people have to say, and I do want to hear people make an argument, for all of the things that I'm wrong about, if I'm wrong about all of this. Honestly, I would be happy to hear a very strong argument against this. Maybe it's just not reasonable to compare Connor McDavid to Mark Messier and expect him to be the same kind of leader and the same kind of captain. But here's a question that I feel like I have to pose to you. I have to ask you this question and, give me your answer in all honesty. If Connor McDavid were to come out and do what Mark Messier did when he was the captain of the Rangers, if he were to come out and say, I guarantee that we will win our next game, would you believe? Would you run out to to your nearest lotto retailer and get yourself a Sports Select and bet your house and your car and your truck and your life savings that the Edmonton Oilers were going to win the next game strictly because Connor McDavid guaranteed that they would win? Would you do that? Because I know for a fact that there are a lot of people out there who would do that for Mark Messier. If Mark Messier were the captain of this team and he came out and said, we're going to win this next game, I know that there are all kinds of people who would be on the phone with Vegas right away looking to cash in on that guarantee. And from what we've already seen is that Mark Messier was the kind of leader who could deliver that. He was the kind of guy that could not only fire up his players to go out and win that game, but he could take it into his own hands. Now, what we have seen is that Connor McDavid, he can take a game into his own hands. He doesn't do it, he doesn't do it often enough to say that he is the singular sole source of the Oilers winning. But I think that one place where we have to question whether or not he can do it is whether or not he can fire up the other players on this team to go win. And I'm sorry, for the entirety of the time that he has been on this team, for the entirety of his time on this team, I have just not seen that out of Connor McDavid. I haven't. But if you have and you can convince me, hey, feel free. The comments are, of course, open. I'm happy to hear from you. So please do. If I'm wrong about that, please set me straight.